Good morning and welcome to the legislator training on school choice sponsored by the Missouri Century Foundation. I'm Susan Pendergrass with the Show Me Institute, and I'm the Director of Research and Education Policy there, and I'll be moderating this morning's training. And I want to thank everyone for taking the time out to join us from your busy schedules. I want to let you know a few things housekeeping wise. If you have a question while the speakers are presenting, please put that into the question and answer box. And we will be putting several links to resources in the chat box. And also, this is being recorded. So if you have to jump off early, or if you want to share it with your colleagues or your staff later, you'll be able to do that. So this morning, we're here to talk to you about school choice. And the presenters are going to be Dr. Mike McShane of EdChoice. He's the Director of National Research at EdChoice, giving you sort of the background, the ABCs on how school choice works and different types of programs. Then Jason Bedrick, also of EdChoice, the Director of Policy at EdChoice, will be talking a little bit about the finances and how it might work. And then Rochelle Engen of the Institute for Justice, the Education Choice Fellow at the Institute for Justice, will be talking about any constitutional issues regarding school choice. And finally, Dr. James Scholes, an Associate Professor at the University of Missouri St. Louis, will be talking about Missouri-specific topics regarding school choice. They're each going to talk for about 5 minutes or so, and we'll have a chance to do question and answers after each of the presentations, and then some more to at the end, but we want to save plenty of time for Q&A. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. McShane to talk about the ABCs of school choice.
Thank you so much. I'm going to share my screen here. I've got some PowerPoint slides. Always hoping that this functions. Are folks seeing my PowerPoint slides here? We're getting the thumbs up. Love to see that. This is still showing what people, Everybody seeing what I'm hoping to show to people?
We're seeing it. We're also seeing like next slide on the right and notes on the right. I don't know if you want.
Well, luckily I didn't make any notes or anything. How about now?
There you go.
All right, there we go. All right, well, it's great to be with everybody this morning. I'm coming at you live from sunny Kansas City, Missouri. I hope wherever else in the state you all are calling in from is lovely, but ready to let some of that snow melt and get things moving. So as Susan said, my goal here is just to give a very quick overview. Like we said, if you've got questions, please put them in the chat. But some of the conversations in Missouri have, with respect to school choice, have been about tax credit scholarships. They've been about education savings accounts. And so I just want to try and answer 2 questions. One is, well, I guess 3. What's a tax credit? What's an ESA? And where are the places in the country that are already doing stuff like this? So that's the very quick thing I'll do at the beginning. And as I said, happy to answer any questions that you all might have. All of the data that I'm going to present to you today comes from our publication at EdChoice, the ABCs of School Choice. It actually, the 2021 version just came out this week. I know it was on all of your calendars, and the the calendar little notification was something that you look forward to every year, but this is out. Hopefully you can find it on our website. If you just look EdChoice, ABCs of School Choice, there are hard copies that are available that we can ship to you, but it's basically like a physician's desk reference of every private school choice program in the country. We have enrollment information, all the requirements, everything that's part of it. So that's what we're basically pulling out of here. So let's start with these education savings accounts. So how do education savings accounts work? Now, some of you might be familiar with vehicles that are similar to these, like health savings accounts, where some portion of money is put into a fund that has restricted uses. So if you take your health savings account to CVS, you can't buy a bottle of Jack Daniels with it, but you can buy Tylenol. The same thing sort of works here with education savings accounts. So if we think about the way that they function, sort of flowing along this chart, money goes into a fund that's managed in some form of a debit card. Eligible students who participate spend that money on schooling options. Again, it's restricted to educational options. They report those expenses. They continue to use those ESAs. They thrive in the program. They have a wonderful time. But the easiest way to think about an education savings account is simply taking some amount of funding for education and putting it in a flexible use account. So if folks want to take that money and spend it entirely at one private school, for example, for tuition, dynamite, that's great. If they want to split it up between multiple different providers, maybe you've got a great math tutor and a wonderful science tutor or someone who's teaching foreign languages. That's basically the way that they work. They're a flexible use spending account for education expenditures. So now, where do these things take place? We have 5 states across the country: Arizona, where Jason is joining us from, Mississippi, Tennessee, North Carolina, and Florida all offer some form of education savings account. So these are not a new program. It's not like something that Missouri would be the first trying to do, but that's where they exist. So the second one that we talk about is tax credit scholarships. And in some ways we're talking, I know there's been some discussion in places about funding ESAs via tax credit scholarships. Now, tax credit scholarships are a little bit more complicated, but not too difficult. From the easiest way of thinking about it is that donors make a donation to a scholarship granting organization. So if I were to open the Mike McShane Foundation for students to attend school, and it's a 501c3 nonprofit, someone gives money to that scholarship fund. The scholarship gives the scholarship granting organization gives those scholarships to students. And then when tax time comes around, those donations are credited against the tax liability that someone has. So from the user's perspective, like the family that would get the scholarship, they would apply to the scholarship granting organization, just like there are so many scholarship granting organizations around the state already. But it's just that donations to those organizations would receive a tax credit for that. So these are very, very popular programs. They exist. There are 24 different tax credit scholarship programs in 19 states across the country. And if you look at Mighty Mo right there in the middle, in almost every state around us has a tax credit scholarship program, right? Oklahoma, Kansas, Iowa, Illinois, Indiana. And when I look at this map, we see this isn't like a red state thing. This isn't like a blue state thing. This is something that we see all across the country. And this, if I were to show you this map last year, the year before, the 5 years before that, these just continue to spring up all across the country. So I don't want to go too in depth. I know the other folks that are on the call are going to be giving you some more details, but hopefully we just gave the nice overview there of what these ESAs are, what tax credits are, and where they exist across the country now. So I'm going to go ahead and unshare my screen and pass it back to you, Susan.
Great, thank you. One question. Do you think in the COVID pandemic, one of these programs emerges as preferable over another, or do you see states moving towards one of these in response to what parents are experiencing this year?
I think that COVID tells us about both of these things. So on the tax credit front, I think one of the things that I've really been heartened by, impressed by during this sort of COVID era is the incredible generosity that Americans have shown towards one another. Like I know here in Kansas City, the Chiefs players were all for Harvesters, which is a great kind of food kitchen. They were all challenging each other to donate more money, to buy more meals for people. There's just been an incredible outreach that's happened there. So it seems that here in Missouri and across country, there is an incredible philanthropic spirit amongst people. So I definitely see tax credits being a way to encourage that, support that, reward that, et cetera. At the same time, I think that the coronavirus has shown the wisdom of things like education savings account programs, right? What I think so many families encountered over the course of this last year was kind of like a single point of failure, right? Their school, and this, to be clear, these were traditional public schools, some private schools, some public charter schools. Folks either wanted to send their kids in person and weren't able to, or they weren't comfortable sending their kids in person and they were sort of required to, or have a remote learning option that wasn't as good. What an education savings account does is say, you're not wedded to one school building. You're not wedded to the decisions of one provider. So it's sort of like, look, if I'm kind of putting education together from a couple different people and one of them isn't doing something that I don't like, that's cool. Like 4 out of 5 things are still going well and we can work there. So I think creating that more diffuse system, that system that's less, it's less fragile, it can handle these sort of shocks better. I think that the coronavirus has shown just how important having that is.
Right.
Can I jump in too, Susan?
Yeah.
Because I think it's also important to realize that these two things aren't mutually exclusive. Right. So we have bills here in Missouri that are tax credit funded ESAs. So the tax credit is sort of the funding mechanism, and the ESA is sort of the delivery mechanism.
Okay, that's great. That's very helpful. Okay, so I noticed in one of your slides, Mike, that you had ESAs working their way through the system, and it got to this debit card of how parents might get it. But our next speaker is Jason Bedrick of EdChoice, and he's going to explain more specifically how these might get administered and how the schools that participate could be held accountable.
Thank you so much. And let me also share my screen. Oh, there we go. All right. So as Mike already explained, ESAs are restricted use bank accounts that can be used for a wide variety of educational expenses or saved for the future. So the question I want to get into is, well, first, what does it mean to be accountable? Because one of the main questions, or actually main attacks that you hear on all sorts of school choice programs is, oh, these are going to unaccountable schools, or that the money is, it's all unaccountable. So what is accountable? Accountable is subject to the obligation to report, explain, or justify something. Responsible, answerable. So I think we should look especially at those last two words. It means being accountable, responsible, or answerable to someone. And the real question is, to whom? So the best form of accountability is when you are directly accountable to those who bear the consequences of your performance. In this case, that would be the children, but the closest you can get to that is the parents. So being directly accountable to the parents would be the highest form of accountability. Unfortunately, with our geographically assigned district school system, we don't have that exactly. The schools are not directly accountable to the parents, especially in a case where you've got maybe a lower income community where the families can't afford to live in a community that has a better school system or can't afford to pay private school tuition. So they're essentially a captive audience. It operates almost like a monopoly. So what do we do in the cases where there is some sort of public monopoly, like a utility company? Well, what we do is we add all of these top-down regulations. Since they're not directly accountable to the consumer, we have to regulate them from above. One of the problems, I think, in the K-12 system is that we have lost sight of the fact that that all of this top-down accountability, being accountable to elected politicians or unelected bureaucrats, is really a second best, at best scenario, instead of being directly accountable to the parents. And we have come to confuse all of those regulations with accountability itself. But real accountability is when you've got parents who have the ability to take their funds and leave when a school system or education provider is not meeting their needs. All right, so again, accountability for what and to whom. So we're breaking down accountability into two areas here. So financial accountability, and by that I mean making sure that the funds are only spent for the purposes for which they have been allocated. That is properly a role of the government. If the government is either directly through an appropriation or indirectly through tax credits, making sure, providing the funding, it makes sense that the government has the accountability on behalf of the taxpayers of making sure that the funds are spent for an appropriate purpose. But as far as the academic accountability, and by that I mean making sure that the children are in a provider that is meeting their needs, that is appropriately to the parents, who are in the best position to see what is actually going on with their children and have the strongest incentive to make sure that their child is actually receiving a quality education. So on the financial accountability side, again, this is making sure that the ESA funds are used for their intended purpose. There are three different types of systems that states have been using so far. So Florida was using this reimbursement model. In other words, families, Mike identified a number of different areas that you could purchase tuition, you could purchase homeschooling curricula, online learning, tutors, educational therapy, right? So in Florida, the families would go out, they would make that purchase themselves, and then they would submit an expense report with their receipts to the scholarship organization that was running the ESA program, and they would be reimbursed. Now this is, this makes sure that nobody is purchasing things that they're not meant to be purchasing. However, it means that lower income families are often not able to fully benefit from the program because they would be expected to front the money, and very often they just simply can't. And so what a number of states did is they went with a debit card. Arizona is still using a debit card, and I think Mike went over this a little bit, but with a debit card, like you said, you can't just take this and run off to Caesar's Palace. You can only use it at an appropriate vendor. However, if the program were large enough, if there were enough families participating, then it would be cost effective to have product codes. But usually these programs are too small for that. And so what they go with instead is vendor codes. So the only approved vendors are those that sell approved products. However, sometimes you do have vendors that are selling non-approved products as well as approved products. So there have been cases where there has been some misspending, which I'll get into in a few minutes. The way that they tried to minimize that, in addition to informing families of what is the appropriate categories of spending, every quarter there is a disbursement of funds. But before you can get your quarterly disbursement, you need to submit all the receipts from the previous quarter. And that is when the department that oversees the program or scholarship organization or whichever entity it is that's in charge would flag inappropriate expenditures. Now, most of the cases of misspending, it was just, something innocent. Parents went and they were buying a bunch of approved educational items, and then they also bought, some crayons or some colored pencils or some other things that they didn't realize weren't actually approved. And then all they have to do is pay that back into their account, or you could deduct it from the next quarterly disbursement. So no problem there. What a lot of states are doing now is they are moving to an online platform. So right now, 4 states, Arizona, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Oklahoma, are using Class Wallet. Now, 3 of those states actually have an ESA. Oklahoma does not have an ESA, but they created this new program that they're calling micro grants, which sort of operate like ESAs using CARES Act funding. But Class Wallet is operating in these 4 states. You also have another group called SAP Ariba, who is working with Florida. Arizona has both the debit card and the Class Wallet. They're trying to migrate everybody over. They're using different categories and they're sending people over to Class Wallet. The way Class Wallet works is you have this online platform, and people can log in. They can see exactly how much money that they have in their account, and they make purchases through the online platform. They call it like a walled garden, and everything within the walled garden is approved. So that's the great thing, is that you have a high degree of transparency and accountability for the funds, and you are ensuring that since the only purchases they can make is through this platform, and the only way that a vendor can get into the platform is not only by being an approved vendor, but also only providing approved products and services, that everything in this system is going to be used for the right purposes. So Mike went through some of these, so I can go through it, but these are the sort of things that you would be purchasing: tuition, tutoring, textbooks, curriculum, in some cases even computer hardware or technological devices. That's especially for students that have special needs, uniforms, standardized tests, therapies, that's used quite a bit. And some states even allow fees for transportation, very often up to $750. We see that in other states, these reports are a little outdated. There are some new reports that are going to be coming out later this year from some different universities, but they're not out yet. What we see is that the vast majority of funds are spent for private school tuition. This is in Arizona. Tutoring and educational therapy are the second two categories. This makes sense, especially because about 60% of the students in Arizona are students with special needs. In the other four programs, they're all students with special needs. And what some of the newer data show is that there's quite a bit more customization going on, but private school tuition is still by far the #1 area of spending. Likewise, in Florida, you can see from 2014-15 and 15-16, the vast majority of the funding is going toward tuition, and then instructional materials, and again, special needs services being the second two, and then tutoring. So you will hear these horror stories coming out of Arizona. $700,000, of ESA funds spent on beauty supplies, apparel, and so on and so forth. First of all, it's very important to put this into context. Okay, $700,000 was actually about 1% of the program funds that were misspending. The Auditor General in Arizona found that most of the misspending was actually, again, where those parents were innocently purchasing pens and paper and pencils and whatnot, and didn't realize, they were new to the program, and then, they just had to pay that money back into the account. So almost all of these dollars were actually recovered. The cases that were truly egregious, where somebody bought a big screen TV or whatnot, were cases where somebody's card had been compromised or stolen. Sometimes there are hackers that can compromise a card reader. So you purchase something, and the next thing you know, you're getting an email saying, from some company that you bought something from, saying, sorry, your card was compromised. And before long, they've spent some of these funds. But this is one of the reasons why they are moving to that online system, to prevent that. It's also worth noting that this is, even with those few problems that the opponents of the program love to highlight, you've got fraud at about 1%, or misspending, I should say. Fraud is actually well below 1%, but misspending at about 1%. The GAO, the Government Accountability Office, finds that across 79 federal programs run by 17 agencies, the fraud or error rate was actually 4.7%. So this is already a highly accountable program, and we've learned some lessons, and it's going to be an even more accountable program going forward. Worth also noting that this is Jonathan Butcher, who wrote this up from the Heritage Foundation. He noted that the National School Lunch Program lost nearly $800 million just in 1 year, and the School Breakfast Program about $300 million. They had improper payment rates of 16 and 23%. I don't see any of the people saying that we should, who are calling to block ESAs, are calling for these two programs to be shut down for massively more misspending. So again, we've got Class Wallet. One of the great things about Class Wallet is that it is moving in the direction of not only being able to provide financial accountability, but also academic accountability, making sure that kids are in the learning environment that best suited to their needs. Parents have a wide variety of legitimate desires, smaller class sizes, better education, responsive staff, safety, character development. These are all important parts of education. We did a study several years ago asking families what it was that they were looking for. Higher standardized test scores was pretty low on their list. They were looking for, overall better learning environment, education, class sizes, individual attention, right, religious education, but test scores did not rank particularly high. The Fordham Institute even found, you could break down families into at least 6 different types of groups that had different goals for their children, which is perfectly acceptable. So you can only get that if you have a system of choice where there are multiple options for these families. So one of the things I previewed is that these online platforms will very soon be able to provide information sort of like Yelp. There was a study a number of years ago that actually showed that there was a professor who was, with a very high degree of accuracy, using Yelp scores, able to predict whether or not, an 82% success rate, he could predict whether they would fail a health inspection or not, right? So it turns out that if you are not so great at providing customer service and tasty food at a good price in the front end, you probably in the back end didn't have a particularly clean environment either. And so this actually helped the state inspectors, instead of just doing random inspections all across the board, they could narrowly tailor their inspections and go to the areas that were getting low Yelp scores. So in other words, the feedback that people were getting from the consumer also carried over into other areas that the consumer couldn't necessarily know about. And by the way, people will, how many people go to some government website to see what the health score is versus go to see Yelp to see what's going on? Well, it's the same sort of thing in education. How many people go to the government website to find out what the grade is versus how many people go to websites like Great Schools or Noodle? I'm already going long, so I'm going to fast forward through some of this. SAP Ariba is already moving in this direction. SAP Ariba is trying to create a platform sort of like Yelp. So all of the appropriate purchases that people can get through their online platform, very soon you will also be able to provide Yelp style reviews that will help families make better decisions. So not only do these platforms improve the financial accountability, but very soon they will also help empower families when it comes to academic accountability. And we can see that these programs are, families are very highly satisfied with these programs. This was a study from the first year of the Arizona program, where they were all students with special needs. 100% of the ESA families said that they were satisfied with the education they got with the program, when fewer than half said that they were satisfied with their previous public school. And when you broke it down based on income, it was that lowest income group that were the least satisfied with their previous public school. They were the most likely to say that they were very satisfied with the education they were able to receive with their ESA. So you can see that it's the lowest income families, the most choice deprived, that have the most to benefit from receiving an ESA. And that's translated into incredible levels of public support. After describing what an ESA is and how it works, our most recent data from 2020 shows that 76% of parents of school-age children support an ESA. And this has stayed pretty steady over the last year. Very high levels of support, very low levels of opposition among the general public, and especially among parents of school-age children. So again, accountability means being answerable to those who bear the consequences of your performance. Parents have a variety of legitimate interests in education, and these online payment systems can help provide both financial accountability and empower families with academic accountability. So
thanks so much, Jason.
Pass it on.
Tons of stuff there. And again, just want to repeat, the PowerPoints will be available for you guys anyone to go back and review, but for state legislators, that was lots of great stuff. And I'm sure it'll be good stuff to go back to look at and digest a little bit more. Meanwhile, we want to talk about constitutional concerns, because I know this comes up. We've got concerns about fraud, which were addressed, but also concerns about constitutionality of these programs. So I'm going to turn it over to Rochelle Enkin of the Institute for Justice to talk about that.
Good morning, everyone. It's great to be with you today. I am going to spend a little bit telling you about the constitutionality of these types of programs that Mike and Jason have been talking about. Is everyone able to see my screen okay? Good, I'm getting the thumbs up. I like that. All righty, so let's begin. School choice, as we know it today, has been around for quite a while, several decades, but is it constitutional? I'm sure you've heard about many Supreme Court cases, several of those on school choice, and the short answer is yes. So the first time the Supreme Court took up the constitutionality of school choice was in 2002. Cleveland, Ohio had passed a voucher program for low-income students in failing public schools. Families were really excited about it. The program passed, it was challenged, and actually we at the Institute for Justice intervened on behalf of some families who really, really wanted to use this program. And the case made it all the way to the Supreme Court. And the question before the court was whether or not this program in Cleveland that was designed to help low-income families that were in failing public schools by providing them scholarships that they could use at private schools, any private school of their choice, religious or non-religious, whether that violated the First Amendment of the United States Constitution. And the Supreme Court said no, that ultimately parents are being empowered by these programs, that they are being given the choice to, use their dollars that they're getting through these programs to go where they want, and therefore this is in fact constitutional. The Supreme Court has also ruled on the constitutionality of tax credit programs, which we've talked quite a bit about today. And in a case out of Arizona, which was the first state to pass a tax credit scholarship program in 1997, a case made it up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court ultimately said, like contributions that lead to charitable tax deductions, contributions that yield scholarship tax credits are not owed to the state and in fact pass directly from taxpayers to private organizations. This will be really important as we continue this conversation. But in short, this means that donations that are given in exchange for tax credits do not constitute public funds. And this was really, really important before a case I'm sure you've heard a lot about, Espinosa versus Montana Department of Revenue, because this decision allowed states that had Blaine amendments to have tax credit programs and those programs be constitutional. However, now we're going to get to Espinosa. So Montana decided to jump on the school choice bandwagon in 2015 and passed their first school choice program. It was a tax credit program that allowed individuals to claim $150 tax credit if they donated to one of the scholarship granting organizations that Mike was talking about earlier. In turn, low-income students could apply for a scholarship to attend the school of their choice. And this program really was a lifeline for many families, like the Espinosas. And the family you see here is Kendra Espinosa. She is a single mom in Montana, and she had homeschooled her children. Her husband left in the middle of the night. Her whole world was turned upside down, and she didn't know what she was going to do. She had to go back to work. She thought her really only option was to put her kids in public school, so that's what she did. And it didn't go very well. She had one daughter who really needed extra attention and smaller class sizes to be able to succeed, and another child who was very badly bullied. So she pulled her kids out. She said, I can't do this anymore. I'm going to send them to Stillwater Christian School, which was a private Christian school in the state near her home. And it's been a challenge for Kendra. Like I said, she's a single mom. She had been a stay-at-home mom, so she hadn't worked in a long time. And in addition to her day job, she picked up a night job cleaning, and her daughters cleaned and mowed lawns and did all sorts of things just to be able every quarter to come up with the money to pay the tuition. So they were very excited about this program because it was going to be really helpful to her family. However, after the program was passed, the Department of Revenue in Montana made rules for the program. And because of a part of Montana's constitution called a Blaine Amendment, they made a rule that said students could not use their scholarships to attend religious schools, even if that school was the school of their choice. IJ thought that was unconstitutional. We intervened on behalf of Kendra Espinosa, her daughters, and a couple others to challenge this rule. And so now we enter Blaine amendments. The case made it all the way to the Montana Supreme Court, and arguments really focused on whether or not these infamous Blaine amendments could exclude students from using their scholarships at religiously affiliated schools, even if that school was the school of their choice. And in December of 2018, the Montana Supreme Court ruled and struck down the entire program because of the state's Blaine Amendment. Now we're going to jump back to the 1800s, just a little jump here, to kind of get into where these Blaine Amendments are coming from, how they've become so popular, why they are so widely talked about. So in the early 1800s, common schools were beginning to set up, and these were really the first public schools. They were very different and very similar to the public schools we know today. Basically, if you replace technology and religion, everything is about the same. You're still in one room and you still learn all day long. But what was really different about these schools from today's schools is they were Protestant in nature. they truly were religious schools, if you will. They taught the Protestant Bible and they sang Protestant hymns, and people were happy with them and it was working well. Well, around this time, there was a large influx of Catholic immigration into the United States. And the Catholic immigrants wanted to be able to teach and learn their own beliefs in the common school system. So they asked for money to start their own schools. This spurred a movement to consolidate a lot of these common schools into non-sectarian schools. They were called non-sectarian, but their Protestant teachings would remain for many years to come. And so this is how we get to the Blaine Amendment. So in this move, as Catholics really wanted money for their own schools, but the Protestants didn't like that idea, an individual named James G. Blaine, a senator from Maine, that's a tongue twister for you, introduced a federal constitutional amendment to ban sectarian schooling. But really, sectarian just meant Catholic. They didn't want the Catholics to be able to have their own schools. That federal amendment failed, but 37 states, one being Missouri, adopted some rendition of this federal Blaine Amendment. And for a long time, opponents to school choice have used this as a barrier to school choice. And it has, in fact, been a barrier to school choice. And like I said, Missouri does, in fact, have a Blaine Amendment found in Article 1, Section 7 of the state's constitution, that essentially says no money shall ever be taken from the public treasury, directly or indirectly, in aid of any church, sect, or denomination of religion. But this is really important because Missouri's Blaine Amendment is incredibly similar to the Blaine Amendment that was at question in the Espinosa case. So in the Espinosa case, the question before the Supreme Court was, does it violate the United States Constitution to invalidate a generally available and religiously neutral student aid program simply because the program affords students the choice of attending religious schools? And the court said that a state doesn't have to subsidize private education. So a state doesn't have to have one of these school choice programs. But once a state decides to pass one of these programs, it cannot disqualify some private schools just because they are religious. So what does this mean for Missouri? Like I said, Missouri's Blaine Amendment is very, very similar to the Blaine Amendment that was at issue in Espinosa. And historically, Missouri has interpreted its Blaine Amendment very restrictively, meaning prior to Espinosa, tax credit scholarship programs were the only viable private school option in this state. And those were viable because under the decision I mentioned earlier in Arizona's School Tuition Organization versus Wynn, the Supreme Court ruled that private tax credit scholarship programs are constitutional because the funds are never ending up in the state coffers, and they are not public funds, they are private funds. However, in light of Espinosa, Missouri can no longer apply its Blaine Amendment to bar religious options from publicly funded educational choice programs. So that means not only are tax credit scholarship programs constitutional in this state, so are voucher or publicly funded scholarship programs, voucher or publicly funded ESA programs, or tax credit ESA programs like this state is looking at right now. So all of this to say that the programs that you've heard a lot about earlier today by Mike and Jason are constitutional in the state. And it's really exciting because there have been significant barriers in Missouri and those barriers are no longer there. And if Missouri decides to pass a program, the state cannot restrict students from choosing any type of private school or any type of education. They have the choice to choose what is best for them, and that is in fact constitutional. And so with that, I will kick it back over to Susan and not bore you with any more constitutional or legal mumbo jumbo.
Thanks, Rochelle. That was great. And in the interest of time, I'm going to go on and to Dr. James Schultz talk about how these programs could be tailored specifically for Missouri and the Missouri environment right now.
Great, thank you so much. And thank the Century Foundation, the Show Me Institute, EdChoice for being part of this. I, unlike the others, do not have slides, but I'm going to blame that on this not being my day job. Right? My day job is professor at UMSL at the University of Missouri, St. Louis. And so I'm just going to talk to you a little bit about school finances, specifically as it relates to these choice programs and as it relates to here in Missouri. So I know I've written several papers on how these types of programs impact state finances, whether or not they save money or they cost money. I know Mike has written some on this, Jason's written on this, Susan's written on this. So you have lots of resources to answer the question of, do they cost money or save money? Because this is oftentimes one of the biggest issues that comes up. And many times the fiscal notes in the legislature are not very friendly. And as I've testified before, and we have published testimony on the Show Me Institute website, the fiscal notes by the state are almost always wrong because they don't account for these things properly. They don't account for the savings properly. But what I want to do now is talk about sort of the basic ideas of when do these programs save money? When do they cost money? So most of the proposals in Missouri that I see always peg the dollar amount of the scholarship to the state adequacy target. Now that state adequacy target is part of the school funding formula, and it's around $6,700. And so we can think about the amount that the state guarantees to every student in this state is $6,700. And a lot of people want to say that, oh, the average we spend on a school district might be lower than $6,700. So if a student in, say, Clayton, where the state spends way less than $6,700 per pupil, leaves, the state's not actually going to save $6,700. But the problem that we have there is that people are talking about averages. And when we're talking about people leaving, we're talking about the margins, right? You're talking about the one student leaving on the margin or the few students leaving on the margin, not the averages. So the point that I'm getting at here is anytime a student leaves from a public school and goes and that reduces the enrollment in that public school for their weighted average daily attendance that they submit to the state to get money, anytime a student leaves, the state is essentially saving that $6,700. And it doesn't matter if they're in a place where the state is giving them $6,700 or a place where they're spending less on average, because we're talking about the marginal student. So the state is going to save money anytime a student switches out of the traditional public school and goes to or uses this type of scholarship fund. Well, I say save money. I mean, if they come and save that $6,700 and are provided $6,700 through the form of a tax credit or a scholarship, then you could think about it being a wash in terms of state dollars, but you're going to save local dollars, right? The state funding, the way it works is it's a partnership really between local and state dollars. And so even though the state is saving money, or it could be a wash, the local district is keeping their local funds. And so overall, locally, per pupil revenue almost always, it's like a rule that per pupil funding goes up. The exception is when it doesn't, right? Like that rarely happens in a school choice program where local per pupil funding decreases. The rule is it almost always increases in a school choice program. And those local funds, the savings there, are never accounted for or very rarely accounted for in state fiscal notes. So that's one thing to keep in mind as you talk about this with colleagues who might say this program's going to cost us money. The fiscal notes are almost always underestimating the local savings, and they're oftentimes miscounting the state savings. So you're going to save money when there are switchers. You're also going to save money when these scholarships are less than $6,700, right? The scholarships don't always have to be $6,700. So what could happen in these programs when they dish out the ESAs or the vouchers or whatever it is, the scholarships, it could be the case that they give my family a $2,000 scholarship and they give Mike's family a $3,000 scholarship, but they give some other family that's more disadvantaged the full $6,700, right? So if you have that sort of case where the average scholarship amount is less, and by the way, that's almost always the case. The average scholarship amount is relatively low. We've published stuff on this before at the Show Me Institute. Jason Bedrick's written about this before, that the savings are going to be even higher, right? And so all these things that people toss out about this costing the state money, or it's going to be this huge new expense, are almost always overblown. Our estimates oftentimes show state savings when we implement these programs. But all of these things matter. What percentage of people are switching? What percentage of people would have been in private schools had we not had this program? How much is the scholarship amount? All these variables matter. But the ultimate point here is that the programs are not nearly as expensive as your colleagues tell you, and they are oftentimes generating savings. I want to touch on maybe one other point. I didn't look at my time to see how much time I had, but I want to touch on maybe one or two other points, actually. When we talk about tax credits, some people like to criticize and say, oh, if we give 100% credit to these businesses, they're profiting. They're profiting because they can get a 100% credit towards their state taxes and use those donations as a deduction for their federal taxes. What that means is the business, I mean, it's a wise business decision for them or the individual who donates to this, but I find it strange to call profit keeping your own money. So the program could be beneficial to these individuals, but it's hardly safe to call it or fair to call it profit. But one of the great things about structuring a tax credit with 100% credit is that it incentivizes people to participate. It incentivizes our local businesses to fund money into education in a way that helps spur growth in this sector and spur improvement. Last piece, sort of unrelated points here that I want to touch on. One of the sponsors of one of these bills brought this up when I was last testifying in Jefferson City, that people will criticize and say, well, $6,700, that's just not enough, which I find a funny criticism. I mean, I'm all for school choice. If you want to spend more on it, let's do that. But that criticism that $6,700 isn't enough is ridiculous. The average tuition in a private school in Missouri, the sticker price tuition, is between $6,000 or $10,000, depending on which statistics you look at. But let's assume it's $10,000. That's the sticker price. And it's very rare that all families pay the full sticker price. Almost every school offers some sort of scholarship. And almost every school offers particularly scholarships to those who are in need. And so what you're doing is you're closing that opportunity gap between what the school might have been able to offer and what they can now offer to families with that additional $6,700 that a disadvantaged family might receive. So don't let that argument deter you from supporting school choice, because it's really a red herring to say this sticker price is too high, this won't help anyone, is just a red herring. $6,700 scholarships are going to open doors for so many families throughout Missouri. So I've touched on several different points, laid out some sort of general principles, and I'll stop there in case there are questions.
I have a question for you, James. For legislators who are listening who have been reluctant to consider school choice in the past because they're from rural areas and they believe that rural parents don't want this, don't need it, or there's not private schools in the rural areas. And what do you say, because most of this state is rural, what do you say to rural legislators who are trying to decide where they stand on school choice programs?
Yeah, so the political issue with your local school boards is one issue, but the availability of options for families. Several years ago, we published an essay, and I'm forgetting the name of it, but I put a map in there with where all the private schools are in Missouri, and we put this sort of 30-mile radius around it. And as you look at it, almost the vast majority of students in the state have access to a private school within driving distance. So that, for the most part, is not really an issue that should prevent you from supporting school choice. The other thing we shouldn't forget is the possibility that new schools open when this becomes available. I mean, right now in St. Louis, we're seeing private schools close because it's hard to compete with free public schools and free public charter schools. But with this type of scholarship, you might see not only the existing schools expand and offer more seats to families, but new schools come into the market because they can now make sense of that business model in a smaller community, which they didn't think they could before. So I think those are key things to keep in mind. Another thing, Susan published some work about what schools did during the pandemic. And there were some rural schools that did nothing, that offered nothing to families. And what this could also do through an ESA is provide options where you don't have to think about the local school, right? You could have people supported in homeschooling or doing some sort of virtual schooling. So it really provides a lot of options. So this rural urban issue to me shouldn't be an issue preventing someone from supporting school choice.
Okay, that's great. I also would mention, we have some recent survey data on Missouri parents and from December. And we do know that lots of parents are unhappy this year, and many, I think in rural areas, are also taking advantage of the opportunity to create micro schools or pandemic pods. So there's lots of flexibility in some ESA programs. So I do think that it's a straw man to say, you said red herring, so I'll say straw man to say that rural parents don't want this, because I think parents want it. But one question for you, Mike, is what do you think about the timing on school choice programs in Missouri? You've been around Missouri education policy for a long time, pretty long, I think, right? I don't know, long. And what do you think about the timing? Why 2021 versus 2018 or 2024?
It was funny. I was just on a call with a reporter yesterday who asked me a very similar question, looking at this, because this is sort of wildfire that's catching all across the country. I mean, we're seeing it in legislatures all across the country. And I think it's just hard to discount the role of the coronavirus. I think it just opened so many people's eyes to the necessity for school choice, for families to have options, for them to not be wedded to one school or one district. And so I think, there are so many things over the course of the last 5 or 10 years that people want to point to, but I think that this very, very disruptive event just really opened a lot of people's eyes.
Thank you. And I want to thank all of our panelists and the Missouri Century Foundation for putting this together. I do want to say once again that EdChoice has a legislator training hub with lots of materials, lots of documents that you can look through if you have more questions. Also, the email addresses of all of the participants from today will be made available in case you have any follow-up questions. And I would encourage anyone with questions to reach out to me as well at the Show Me Institute. So we got a lot of expertise here in this panel. A lot of people who are very familiar with Missouri legislation, Missouri legislators, and nationally the issues. So please take advantage of that if you as a legislator have any questions. And with that, I just want to say thank you to the panelists and thank you to everyone for joining.